Hello. Today is the funeral of the Duchess of Kent, and it's an unusual event. And it seemed to me right that we should try and mark the event in respect to her, but also out of respect for her conversion to the Catholic faith. Because symbolically, this was a moment that had real impact in the life of the nation, though the nation may not know about it. But let me give you an example. Last night, when her coffin was brought to the cathedral, it was brought to Westminster Cathedral. This is the first royal funeral that's taken place in the cathedral since it was built, since 1903. This is enormously significant because the royal family have had to be Protestant essentially by Act of Parliament. The Act of Settlement in 1701 required the royal family to be Protestant and to be wedded to the Protestant establishment. And so Katherine, as she was, became the Duchess of Kent, was the first member of the inner royal family to become a Catholic. And it seemed that what we might want to do is to look at why and what the influences on her were, and to pay tribute to her journey. Her own life was a life of humility and service. She spent 17 years teaching music at a school in Hull, under the pseudonym, although of course it was her real name too, of Mrs. Kent. Nobody knew she was the Duchess of Kent. She had two tragedies in her life. One was that she became pregnant with a child and caught rubella. And everyone advised her to have an abortion, and so she did. And she was marked by that for life. She became pregnant again, hoping for a new child, and the child was born stillborn. She made a connection between these two events. It's not for us to do so, but she did. And it was a matter of profound regret and sorrow and tragedy for her. She developed ME in her life, which made life much more difficult as well. But her conversion was something she spoke about in a very simple way. She said it wasn't that she started reading the Bible in a particular way, but she was profoundly influenced by two men in particular. One was Basil Hume, the Cardinal, Benedictine monk, and the other was Thomas Merton. So I thought we might look at both of those men because they've had a really significant influence on others too. But first of all, the principle of what brings you to conversion. For a lot of people, it's done with the heart, as it was with her. This wasn't a matter of her sitting down and working out the theological claims. She saw a degree of authenticity, of holiness, of power, of reality in these two Catholic figures. And heart spoke to heart. She found herself increasingly drawn. Looking back at the Archbishops of Canterbury during her adult life, they were, of course, very good men. And I don't intend to say this with any disrespect at all. But the problem with the archbishops that the Anglican Church threw up in the late 20th century was they looked like bureaucrats. I'm thinking particularly of Robert Runcie, who was the equivalent to Cardinal Hume. He was a very good man. He was a brave man. He fought in the Second World War as a tank commander and was decorated. But there wasn't something about the leaders of the Anglican Church that made you immediately look and say, this is holiness. Competence, integrity, kindness, sincerity. Holiness is something else. And both Basil Hume and Merton had holiness. Basil Hume endeared himself to a number of people. He looked, smelt, sounded like a monk. And there were a lovely couple of quotes he was quite well known for, which I thought were worth looking at. One is, there is no progress in prayer without progress in faith. It is the naked faith which is a terrifying experience. We must learn to wait. You almost expect a monk to say, well, of course you can pray, you just try harder. do it more often, bring more dedication to the task. Basil Hume was a very transparent and a humble man, and this wonderful phrase that naked faith is a terrifying experience speaks to many of us. It's not just the terrifying experience of Moses at the burning bush, or of Elijah at the mountain, or even of the disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration. It's the fact that when we throw ourselves into the hands of the living God, we let go all other handholds, and for a while it's always terrifying. And then, as he says, we have to wait. And there is this letting go and waiting that is right at the heart of the Christian journey. And it's quite encouraging to know that one of the professionals, a Benedictine monk, a man who becomes cardinal, is also terrified and is also stripped naked while he waits, and that we're not alone. I think what's lovely about humility is that it reflects the nature of God himself, who comes alongside us, having been stripped of all that protects him, and waits with us. Thomas Merton was an extraordinarily influential man for a while. He wrote a very famous book called The Seven-Storey Mountain, and it was beautifully written and describes his journey from hedonism to the Catholic faith and then to the monastic life. He had a profound effect on many of us in the 70s and 80s. Actually, I think he went rather badly wrong at the end, as he was seduced by Buddhism and took a path of a cul-de-sac. Very interestingly, he fell in love with a nurse halfway through, and had a very serious crisis of it's not part of the plan for a monk to fall head over heels with a nurse. It was a period in his life that happened. He learned from it and recovered. For a while it was covered up, but then it slowly began to come out into the open, and I don't think anyone can take any other attitude but to say, well, this is part of the meandering of the journey. The wonderful thing about going off the journey is that God always comes looking for us to bring us back. And perhaps what we shouldn't do is criticize the going off the journey, but celebrate the fact that God always comes to bring us back. It's part of the wondrousness of grace and the Christian faith. There are a few moving quotes from Thomas Merton that I thought we might share. One is on suffering. The more you try to avoid suffering, the more you suffer, because smaller and more insignificant things begin to torture you in proportion to your fear of being hurt. The one who does most to avoid suffering is, in the end, the one who suffers most. His suffering comes to him from things so little and so trivial that one can say that is no longer an objective suffering, but almost an entirely subjective one. In other words, we're going to suffer. We might as well suffer for salvation's sake rather than accept the suffering of a discordant, disordered universe. There will be suffering. Let's pursue the real suffering that involves picking up your cross and following Jesus, denying ourselves. Let's pick up the real suffering as we engage in prayer, where we let go of all handholds and we wait. Let's accept the suffering of humility, where we lay aside our egos and our reputations and the way we appear and what we think other people think, and stripped naked stand before God and look to him for his love to make sense of who we are, the mess and the disorder and the failure. That's also suffering. The other day I was rushing to an appointment on my bike, and they cancelled the train and they put a replacement bus on it, and I got there several minutes early and was just walking over the footbridge with my bike on my back, which, having had difficulty being knocked off a motorbike and having injuries to both legs, was problematic. And I called to a man on the other side saying, is that the bus, that's the reserve bus? Yes, I said, you can ask him to wait. So just as he did, the bus began to draw out 3 minutes early. And I shouted. He heard and didn't stop. I stood there knowing there wasn't another train for 2 hours or even a bus. And the scope for irritation was huge. As it happened, a way came to mend the situation. But I thought at the time, this could become a matter of disproportionate frustration. And in the scale of everything, it is nothing. But it depends what one invests one's life in. And if one invests one's life in a form of control, getting oneself to A to B, never being late, never being let down, never being dependent, everything's going wrong, then when they go wrong, we will find it immensely difficult, proportionately difficult to the amount of control we are trying to exercise. And what Merton is saying is, put your eggs in a different basket, put them in the basket of loving God. And then when things go wrong in the more proximate life of the world around us, the proportion will be kept. This is not life and death. This is not a matter of starvation or survival. There's another moment when he talks about his experience of the Holy Spirit. He uses a lovely phrase. I couldn't understand, he said, what it was that made me so happy, so suddenly and completely at peace. This is at Mass. I was still too young and crude in the life of the Spirit to know that this was one of those moments when the soul tastes something of the sweetness of God's mercy. I love this phrase, I was too young and crude in the life of the Spirit. Many of us remain young and crude in the life of the Spirit. And there are all kinds of alternative explanations trying to take away from us the reality of our encounters with God. I think, for example, of a psychologist called Abraham Maslow, who became famous writing about peak experiences and wanted to construe them all in a psychological framework, stripping them of the numinous. And here is Merton reasserting the reality of the presence of God. I couldn't understand what it was in the Mass that made me so happy, so completely and suddenly at peace. I was too young and crude in the life of the Spirit. To know that this is one of those moments when the soul tastes something of the sweetness of God's mercy. God is always injecting the sweetness of his mercy into our lives, particularly in the Mass, particularly in the sacraments, often when we read the scriptures, particularly in the moment of prayer. And this sweetness of his presence is something it's very easy to feel embarrassed about, or to imagine that we've somehow misappropriated human emotion all the moment. We're constructing it for ourselves. So terrified are we of a psychological reductionism that takes away the reality of the transcendent. There's a lovely phrase that Merton had on the futility of our busyness. What a strange thing to live in a world where everybody is running around in circles, trying to get somewhere, and all the time they're right in the middle of what they're looking for. This ceaseless activism trying to possess and to justify is really bad for us. How right it is to notice that everyone is just running around in circles when we are in the middle of what we're looking for. What are we looking for? An answer to who we are, why we're here, where God is, where he wants us to go, how he wants us to travel. To do that, we have to stop chasing the elusive and pursue his presence and wait, stripped naked, as Basil Hume would say. There's a lovely phrase, easily misunderstood, talking about his call to holiness. For me, to be a saint means to be myself. Therefore, the problem of sanctity and salvation is, in fact, the problem of finding out who I am and discovering my true self. Interestingly enough, this can go very badly wrong. There is an idolatry of the true self, a kind of narcissistic turning in on ourselves. But within the Christian journey, we are certainly called to distinguish between our true selves and our false selves. Our false selves are usually what other people want us to be, or what the pressure of family or culture makes us feel we ought to be. We can't construct a true self for ourselves, but It's in relationship with God that we find our true selves. Our true self begins to emerge when we no longer constrict it with guilt that he doesn't want us to own. Because in the sacrament of confession, he sets us completely free. And that sweetness of the Spirit comes and joins us again, if we're not too young and crude in the life of the Spirit to know what it is. To be one's true self is to have a sense of celebration of our quirks and our oddities. God hasn't made me like that person, charming, competent, clever, handsome, endlessly interesting. He's made me like me, and there's no one like me, and he loves it. He made me as an objet d'art, as an enterprise, and he wants to take the beautiful and the good things and make them more beautiful and more good, and he wants to calm and operate and soothe the bad bits. And in his hands, in the hands of the Spirit, I am an extraordinary adventure in becoming, but only in love with him, never freestanding for myself. The Orthodox have a wonderful phrase, which I will say often, and you may get tired of it, but for me, every time I hear it, it's a moment of recalibration. The human task is to stand, or the Christian task is to stand before the real God, with the real self, with the mind in the heart. The real God. That is the one that Jesus Christ shows us the face of, if you pardon my grammar. The real self. That's the distinction between the real self and the false self, and knowing the two. And being a Christian helps us encounter and become free to be our real selves, and free from the false self that is laid upon us by social, cultural, sometimes family expectations. And then with the mind in the heart. And this brings us back to Katherine Wordsley. It's very easy to think that the mind in our culture should take precedence over the heart. For a long time, particularly as a jobbing academic, I thought that the mind had to take precedence for everything. But in fact, the Christian understanding is that the heart, our soul, our heart, our the profundity of our inner being is what takes precedence, and the mind is held and protected and nurtured and demoted there. Katherine Wordsley knew that it was her heart that was touched by Basil Hume, her heart that was touched by Thomas Merton. It was her heart that was touched by Jesus. She said she liked a church that told her what to do, when to go to church, how to go to church, how to behave in church. And she's right, the Catholic Church has this wonderfully developed choreography of how to be a Christian. It does so much for you. You just have to turn up and be there, and it's done for you. Are we making too much of the fact that she was the first royal to convert since 1701? I don't think we are. This isn't a matter of saying, look, our team is better than yours. Come and join our team. Our team is going to win soon. It's a matter of looking at what's happening to Western culture, as you'll hear me say often, and realizing that there is no political solution. And sadly, there is no Protestant solution, and particularly no Protestant solution in a state church, where the church enters into a pact, a Faustian pact indeed, with the body politic in order to exercise its privileges, but at the price of its integrity. It can't say what it wants. It cannot say what Jesus says without being punished or diminished. The Catholic Church is in an entirely different place. And what we want is I want to say to the royal family, you should all come over. The whole notion of kingship is a Catholic idea. All your forebears, all the really important ones, were Catholics. The most beautiful buildings in this country of ours were built by the Catholic Church. The things we really treasure in terms of social care and action were Catholic ideas. Above all, the sanctity of the individual, which meant that the poor were treasured, children were taught, The dying were accompanied, the wounded were made well, not because they had any virtue or money, but because they were made in the image of God, and therefore it was God we were pleasing, as Jesus says in that famous passage in For the sheep and the goats. And so as much as you did it for one of these my brethren, you did it for me. Thank God for Katherine, Duchess of York. Thank God for her life of humility, of courage. Thank God for the fine-tuning of her heart that saw holiness and immediately went towards it. Thank God for her courage, because becoming the only royal since 1701 to become a Roman Catholic must have been very difficult. We're told that a good many people in her family, her children, have followed her, for which we're grateful. May the Lord receive her soul into his hands. May he forgive her all her sins. May he heal all her wounds. May he purge and cleanse and restore her to the brightness and beauty that he intended her soul to reflect. And may he receive her and us into eternal life. God bless her and keep her. Amen.